Israel carried out a raid on an Iranian weapons facility in Syria this week, killing at least 14 people and wounding dozens of others. The information coming from multiple Hebrew media outlets. Syrian media reporting the strikes hit a scientific research center that was affiliated with the manufacture of chemical weapons and precision missiles that are used by both Iran and Syria. The location of the strike about 120 miles north of Israel. Do want to talk about that and the latest developments here out of the Middle East. So let's bring in a friend of the show and a true expert here. Behnam Ben Taleblu is a senior fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, joining us now. Behnam, thank you so much for taking the time, as always, to be here with us.
Good morning, Josh. Always a pleasure.
All right, so I do want to start by talking about this apparent strike here. How significant overall is it for Iran, and what do we really know about how all of this played out? Because a lot of information is coming from kind of various reports from Hebrew media.
That's right. There's a couple of different strands of reporting we can bring together here. But just first note, across the northern tier of the Middle East, the Islamic Republic of Iran has really built a land bridge through a whole series of failed states so that it can project power into the Eastern Mediterranean against Israel. This was part of a larger strategy the regime had built long before October 7. So you have Iran, you have Iraq, you have Syria, and you have Lebanon. And across this permissive jurisdiction, Iran ferries men, money, and munitions to ultimately get Lebanese Hezbollah, which is the crown jewel of all its proxies, to develop more and more lethal and robust capabilities. And many of these capabilities are often moved to Syria first, built in Syria, finalized in Syria, and then moved over the border into Lebanon. So that's why Israel's campaign between the wars, or war between the wars, has really been focused on in the past decade, trying to take out many of these military capabilities and command and control networks that operate so freely in Syria. Now, when it comes to this story, the fact that an Iranian conventional weapons facility is co-located at a Syrian chemical weapons facility should be a big red flag, and more about the permissiveness of Iran's willingness to play footsie with WMD creation in the Middle East. That's number one. Number two is the intelligence the Israelis had to be able to detect this thing. There's multiple stories from the Axios, for example, that are talking about the Israelis watching this facility be built not above ground, but below ground, the tunneling, the digging, the moving of supplies, such that Iran appeared to be trying to create what it has inside Iran, meaning those subterranean nuclear bunkers, as a subterranean weapons production facility inside Syria to make up for the fact that it kept getting hit so many times in Syria. And then number three, this is where the conflicting reporting gets in. This also may have been the first ground operation by the Israelis inside Syria. So there's reports saying that Israeli special forces or paratroopers fast roped in on helicopters and took this facility out and went after those pro-regime assets. When the reporting diverges, however, Axios says no Iranians were harmed. The Times of Israel actually says between 2 to 4 Iranians were kidnapped, were taken from the facility. So it'll be a big deal if actually the Israelis capture IRGC officers, IRGC assets, IRGC personnel on Syrian territory and have taken them back. But it'll also still be a big deal if there was no capture and they also managed to take out this critical infrastructure.
And it's still so early on, so there is still a lot left to figure out, and I'm sure we'll learn a lot over the coming hours and days here, and we'll make sure to pass that along. But thank you for breaking down what we really do know so far. Now, earlier on in the week, we did hear from U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken, who did reveal that Iran has actually provided Russia with some close-range ballistic missiles that will likely be used against Ukraine. So my question for you, can you break down the implications of that overall?
Yeah, and this is something that, in honesty, should not have happened, despite the fact that in the spring of 2022, following Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the U.S. said that the Iranians were going to be giving drones and missiles. And then in the fall of 2022, we saw the Russians begin to use Iranian drones against critical infrastructure and civilian targets in Ukraine. The West, the U.S., the EU, everybody had ample time, NATO, to make sure that the Ukrainians had not just everything they needed to defend themselves from these drones, but that they could signal adequate resolve to the Russians and to the Iranians to not engage in this destabilizing weapons transfer. Make no mistake, this marks the furthest ever and the most important and first ever proliferation of Iranian ballistic missiles into Europe. So in and of itself, this is a political earthquake. Second, there were many things that could have been done to prevent this or try to raise the cost of this. In 2020, the Trump administration tried to work with the United Nations and its European partners to try to restore an international arms embargo. Everyone laughed. 2 years later, Iranian drones are killing European citizens in Ukraine. Once those drones moved to Ukraine, the world had yet another opportunity in 2023, October, to try to prevent the lapsing of an international ballistic missile testing and transfer prohibition that existed at the UN against the Iranians. The world didn't act then, and the Iranians, in my view, connected the dots and said that they could get away with this. And ultimately, it's been reported that they provided close-range ballistic missiles. Close-range missiles are tactical systems. It's a variant of the THAAD family, so this is the most precise single-stage solid propellant ballistic missile in the Iranian arsenal. A variant of this weapon was actually fired at Kurdish positions in September 2022 and actually killed a U.S. citizen using a ballistic missile for the first time in Iraq by the Iranians in the fall of 2022. The U.S. obviously, unfortunately, had not responded to that strike. And again, in the minds of the Iranians, it paved the pathway for more risky behavior. So all of this stuff helps keep Putin in the fight longer.
And you touched on Lebanon a little bit, so I want to talk about what happened earlier in the week where the Israel Defense Forces said that over the course of about 24 hours, you had more than 100 rockets that were fired from Lebanon over at civilians that were in northern Israel. And usually when we think about Lebanon and rockets being fired, we kind of attribute that to Hezbollah, as they normally say it was us. However, this time, some of them actually came from Hamas. So even though we associate Hezbollah with Lebanon, does it appear that Hamas has a stronghold, a large group there in Lebanon as well?
Well, we've seen this actually for the past few years, that obviously Hezbollah is the one with the lion's share of the political and military capabilities because of how much they've been able to suck across from the Lebanese state and de facto turn that into a failed state and a permissive jurisdiction for the Islamic Republic of Iran. But Iran has also been able to make room for or elbow in its other major proxy in the area, Hamas, from the Gaza Strip. We know that for many years now, there's been Hamas leadership living in Lebanon. There actually was an IRGC Hamas-Hezbollah coordination cell. This was something that was publicly reported a few years ago in major Western press that existed in Beirut. So it's no surprise to me that yet another group is going to be taking credit for this kind of stuff. But we even saw this in different iterations of the 2021 war with Israel and Hamas as well, where actually there was some rocket fire from the north and Hamas took credit for it. So it comes as no surprise to me. How much, how many, how capable is an entirely different story, but it's a story that will contrast and pale in comparison to the military successes that the Israelis are having in the south, where they continue to deny Hamas territory, they continue to deplete the Hamas arsenal, and they continue to go after the Hamas leadership. I don't know to date how much of this stuff has been destroyed that's Hamas controlled in the north.
It's been about 2 months since Hamas leader Ismail Haniyeh was assassinated. Now, it's important to note that Israel has not taken responsibility for that. They did not say that they were behind it. However, as a result of that, Iran did say we are going to retaliate. We are going to launch a direct attack on Israel, and it will be, quote unquote, imminent. Again, it's been 2 months. Does it appear that that attack from Iran is still going to happen on Israel, or does anyone really know?
Well, unfortunately, the newsflash here is that the Islamic Republic of Iran has been prosecuting an actual kinetic war and being able to get away with murder, quite literally, against Israel for 11 months now. And that's called the post-October 7 Middle East. In my view, I think obviously the Iranians understood they were outgunned, but in the post-April 13, post-April 14 world, that was when Iran launched directly, overtly, and kinetically from its own territory ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, and drones against the Israelis. They are trying to now weaponize in the minds of folks like the Americans, folks like the Biden administration, the fear of a potentially widening war as we get closer to the election, and the fear of a potentially widening war as we get closer to the 1-year anniversary of the October 7 attack. So in my view, everything that we've seen in the past month and a half, the overdrive of the Biden administration to try to foist a ceasefire onto the Netanyahu government is actually part and parcel of the Iranian diplomatic strategy to threaten a wider war, to spook America, to put the handcuffs on Israel. And if there's a line that one could say here based on the April 13, April 14 attack, when President Biden told Prime Minister Netanyahu to take the win, looking with the perspective of time and distance, in the past 11 months, if anyone has learned how to take the win in the past 11 months in the Middle East, it's been Iran, and they're playing the long game, unfortunately, here.
My last question here, I do want to talk a little bit more about this because you and I have discussed this in the past, but it is one of the questions that we get a lot. Can you kind of break down for us the relationship between Iran and the groups like Hamas and Hezbollah and even the Houthis?
Yeah, absolutely. So the Israelis have come up with an analogy that's quite apt. They say it's the eye of the octopus, and all of these proxies are partners or the tentacles. Some call them allies. The regime itself uses a different word. They use the word axis of resistance. In Iran, you have the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. This group has helped to create or co-opt different proxy forces across a whole series of battlefields and failed states by preying on downtrodden and dispossessed population across this region, and basically putting arms in the hands of these downtrodden and dispossessed folks, such that you have Arabs, Lebanese, Syrians, Iraqis, Yemenis, Gazans firing at the people that the Islamic Republic wants to fire at. So there are some groups like Hezbollah, like in Lebanon, like the Badr Corps or the Shia militias in Iraq that the IRGC has literally helped to create. And then there are some groups like Hamas in Gaza or the Houthis in Yemen that pre-existed, and the Islamic Republic, through sustained material and political and financial support, has been able to co-opt. But this is a diffuse network that the Islamic Republic has been bringing together to fire at Americans, to fire at Israelis, and to accomplish the ideological and strategic goals of the 45-year-old regime in Tehran.
All right, Behnam Ben Taleblu, as always, thank you so much for taking the time to be here with us and break it all down. Anything else you want to add about any of this before I let you go?
Operating in the background, obviously, while the war in the Middle East continues to rage, is one of the things that actually makes Tehran more of a transnational threat than its record of terrorism, and that it's its quest for a nuclear weapon. In the background this week, you had the International Atomic Energy Agency Board of Governors going on in Vienna. You had some tough diplomatic language by the Americans and the Europeans about Iran's expanding nuclear program. You even had lines like, there is no credible civilian justification for what the Islamic Republic is doing. So again, as we get closer to the one-year anniversary of the October 7 terrorist attack, it's important to have a full stock of the threats that Tehran poses, which are not just nuclear and regional, it's nuclear and regional. It's not or, it's always and. So Washington, international partners are going to have to do a much better job of walking and chewing gum, assessing these threats, capping these threats, and rolling back these threats at the same time. Because when you look at the nuclear program since October 7, it's benefited from a lack of coverage and a lack of U.S. policy to roll it back.
All right, Behnam Ben Taleblu, thank you so much for being here with us today. A lot to explain, and I'm glad you were able to break it down.
Thank you.